What's going on, guys? Aaron from Top Tier Gaming here, and today I'm coming at you with an updated best deck tier list post the new ban list. I think a week ago exactly, I uploaded the best decks post Photon Hypernova, and normally when a ban list comes out so shortly after I make one of these, I won't update it because usually the ban list isn't so wild that it changes the entire format. However, this ban list really did, so I am going to be updating this tier list post new ban list because really everything changed from my last list. Like, just talking about the decks is going to be entirely different because tier limit is no longer just infinitely better than almost every other deck. So I am going to go over this tier list and sort of rank everything based on the tiers I have on the screen. Before I do want to let you guys know, Discord link down below along with all of our other social media links. Also, I am trying to hit 14,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy this Yu-Gi-Oh content and you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me out and what I do here on the channel. And without further ado, let's take a look at this tier list. So the tiers I have as followed. We have tier 1, which are going to be like the best decks of the format. So glad I don't have to include like a tier 0 here. Then we have tier 1.5, tier 2, rogue, and not this format. And hopefully this list, I won't have to have so many decks in these bottom two lists. Like, of course, there's going to be a bunch of rogue decks like always, but not this format should be a lot thinner than it has in the past, simply because so many more decks are now viable. And you know, that is super huge. I love when I can have a more spread out tier list instead of like 4 decks up here and then 58 decks down here, right? So let's hop in with the first deck, and it's going to be Cyber Dragon. And even though I just said what I said, Cyber Dragon is going to be not this format. Cyber Dragon just really need support. I know they got Clockwork Knight kind of recently, which is supposed to be like a decent support card for them, but Cyber Dragon, ever since Verte has been banned, really hasn't been, you know, the best deck in the room by far. So these videos always end up being like 30 minutes long, right? So I'm gonna try to go more briefly over the decks in like the bottom 3 tiers, give like a brief thought for them and sort of summarize them a little bit, but I'm gonna try to spend more time in these top 2 tiers. So Spriggans, this is a new one post Photon Hypernova that I actually forgot on that list, but now I am glad to add to this list, and I've actually gotten the chance to play against this deck once on Dueling Book post new ban list, and I was pretty impressed. It actually does some really cool things. Now, whether I want to put it in tier 2 or rogue, I haven't really decided. Again, I've only played against it once and I haven't had the chance to play it myself. So initially I think it's somewhere over here. I've heard some people talk like amazing things about this deck. I'm gonna put it in tier, it really is skirting a line over here. I'm gonna say it's rogue. I think this deck is strong, but I haven't seen enough to put it in tier 2 myself. It does do some really cool things. Its first turn board is wild. You know, its first turn board is good enough. I think you could say it's tier 2. I think you'll see more of this deck than some of the other decks I'm going to put in rogue, so I'll put it in tier 2 for now. Kashtira, this is one, of course, like the bigger decks on this tier list, so this deck I think is no surprise. I'm going to put it in tier 1, but I don't actually think this may end up being the best deck. I think it's the perceived best deck, especially going into the new ban list. I think everyone is thinking that it will be tier 1, or the best deck, I should say, even further. And I think because of that, it might actually not end up being like undisputed the best deck, because I feel like this, you know, Kashtira, unlike tier limit, is much easier to counter. It has harder cards that counter it, like Nibiru, such a powerful card, could do nothing in tier limit format, really. And versus Kashtira, it's insane. It just can like win the game outright as long as you haven't been like Ibleed. So it has harder counters. Things like Book of Eclipse and like even just Book of Moon can be solid versus this deck. You know, its end board almost instantly loses to Lava Golem without, you know, exactly Iblee. I think because of this, it'll actually find itself being hit harder post game 1 compared to like a lot of decks. And I think it might end up being like the second or even third best deck depending on how it shapes up. But I will say it is the perceived best deck right now. I'm just not sure it will stay that way. It's still going to be tier 1. It's still an amazing deck, but you know, I'm interested to see how Kashtira sort of evolves through sort of the format we're in now, because it is going to be incredibly powerful, but I don't think it will be maybe as dominant as people expect. Next we have Tearlaments, and this is an interesting one to talk about. Where do I think Tearlaments is post ban list? By now, I mean, the ban list was revealed like 5 or so days ago, and people have definitely been testing with this deck, and you may have seen videos of people playing with this deck and what it can still do. Honestly, I think tier limit might still be tier 1.5. When I watch the deck play, it still can do some amazing things. It's not unplayable by any means. Potentially it's tier 2, but then again, potentially it's tier 1. Like, tier limit is so hard to judge right now without enough testing because, especially when they're using the Mikanko engine, I've seen it do some wild things. You know, they still have a lot of cool plays in their engine with King of the Swamp and the Graph Fusion now. And the deck can go into a bunch of different directions, and honestly, with the way it's been hit, it's still very playable. Again, it could potentially be a tier lower or a tier higher, but I'm going to preemptively put it in tier 1.5 because I still see the deck being like a pretty strong control-y option because it does a lot more control things now than it used to. So, my hope for tier limit as like, you know, I mean, I don't want tier limit to be the best deck by any means, but I don't expect it to just be thrashed in one list, right? So I'm gonna put tier limit in tier 1.5. Hero, I'm gonna put in Rogue. I think this deck is like a fine deck, but not anything too crazy right now, especially since Dark Law, its best card, isn't hitting like some things in the best deck category, especially not Kashtira. So Rogue for heroes. Dinosaur, I'm gonna put in Rogue. I think this deck is strong as a combo deck. It's more playable now. However, like, again, it's not, until it gets this new support, I wouldn't expect Dinosaur to be anything too crazy. Lithosagem did come to 3, but I don't think I'm willing to put Dinosaur in tier 2. It just isn't as good as a lot of the other decks above it. Is it as good as Springens? Potentially, and that's why Springens was a deck that I had a hard time sort of judging where to put. But I'm going to put Dinosaur in Rogue. Shark, I'm going to put in, maybe Rogue. I think that if you're doing like goes and match stuff with Kragan, it's still pretty okay. It can make Totally Awesome a little bit better than, you know, almost any other deck in the format can now. I'm gonna put it in Rogue. I think a lot of people give this deck a lot of flack, but it's actually pretty okay. Scareclaw. This is another one I actually forgot on my last tier list, so I'm happy to sort of update it and put it here. Now, I don't have a lot of experience with this deck, but it definitely has gotten some forms of support with Scareclaw Kashtira, and I've seen people have new combos with this deck. I don't know if it's tier 2, it might still be Rogue. I haven't seen this deck just do a whole lot. But it did get new support, and I'm wary about putting it in Rogue, and then it actually turns out a lot better than I thought it would be. I mean, I'm still just going to put it in Rogue. I don't think it's, like, that amazing. Again, if the format progresses and I see this deck with its new combos, you can definitely consider it a tier 2 deck if it ends up being better. But I don't think it's, like, better than these decks by a lot, or, I mean, maybe it is tier 2, right? Like, there's a thin line here at this point, especially for the decks I'm less familiar with, but I'm going to put, you know what, I'm going to put Scareclaw, we'll just say Rogue. I just don't know enough about the deck to judge it any more accurately. Labyrinth. This is another really interesting one because a lot of people are really looking at Labyrinth as the premier trap deck now, and not only a premier trap deck, but one of the better decks in the meta. And I do agree, I do think Labyrinth is very strong. Whether I think it's tier 1 or tier 1.5, the thing with Labyrinth is it's one of the trap decks, like Eldritch is another example, where in engine, it doesn't have the best ways to stop its counters, like Lightning Storm, like Harpy's Feather Duster. Take a deck like Dinomorphia, they have settable counter traps from their deck that, you know, in engine negate cards like these. Trap Tricks, when it comes out, is going to be able to stop things like Lightning Storm. With the Arachnocampa that can special summon herself from hand. Labyrinth's best option is to like set a pointer with Lady and then use Kuklok or Temple of the Kings to activate it the turn it's set. And that is one thing going for this deck where I think it's much easier like to be countered than other trap decks. That being said, it is a very powerful engine. Preemptively, I almost want to put it here, but we could see it in tier 1. Preemptively, I kind of want to put it in tier 1.5, but I might change this based on when I'm putting more decks on the tier list. I might actually move Labyrinth to be tier 1 once I get a whole scope of everything and can really judge it based on that. I do think it's going to be strong, but I think trap decks inherently have a lot of problems, especially once they become good, because then you get a lot more Lightning Storms, a lot more Feather Dusters in the side decks, and that is very hard for Labyrinth to deal with, so I'll sort of see where I want to place this by the end. Virtual World. I'm going to put this in Rogue, maybe not this format. It's not great versus almost any of these decks, but as an engine itself, it's still pretty solid, so I'll put it in Rogue. Mikanko, and more specifically Mikanko Libromancer, I actually think is an insane deck. Do I want to put it in tier 1? Is something I'm not really sure yet, because I do think this deck has some inherent problems. It doesn't get to play that many Go second cards, but I do think right now, and this might be like a hot take, but I think it's true. Right now, I think Mikanko Libromancer is probably putting up the best turn 1 board in Yu-Gi-Oh! Outside of like decks like Dark World, where their board isn't that crazy, but they've ripped 5 cards out of your hand, which is something interesting. This or Dark World can put up like the best turn 1 board, because really if Mikanko Libromancer does what it wants to do, it's just an FTK. Their board is honestly insane, and it doesn't lose to things like Dark Ruler because they have a trap that sort of interrupts it. I'm willing to put this in tier 1.5 for now. I think it's above tier limits, but again, this is a deck I see a lot of potential in it, and I think it could be one of the better decks this format, because now it was even seen as okay last format, but without tier limit being that much stronger than everything else, decks like Mikanko Libromancer get a huge boost. Gren Maju, I'll put in Rogue. Sort of the hard go second decks are always like playable enough, kind of, especially at like the local scene, so put Gren Maju here. Earth Machine, I'll put in Rogue. I think it's a solid deck, but not anything too amazing this format. It definitely is going to have a fun time versus a lot of the decks up here. It needs some form of support, I think. Sprite is another very interesting deck to talk about because they just lost Elf, and you've seen a lot of different Sprite variants come into the forefront with Elf being banned. Like, you still have Pure Sprite with like power spells that's trying to use Ahashima to make Totally Awesome still. You have Runic Sprite coming back to an extent. You have Evil Twin Runic Sprite. There's a lot of things with Sprite going on right now, and I don't think they're bad. I think they're actually pretty solid. I'm willing to put Sprite in tier 1.5 as well, but they may again be better because I think like Runic stuff is a very powerful engine right now, but I think Runic Sprite is a little bit weaker than some other things. Sprite is a hard one to rank because it has so many variants, but I think rough average you could put them here. Maybe some of these will have to be placed in tier 1 when I'm later down in the tier list, but preemptively looking at it, I want to put these all right here. Alistair, I'm going to say not this format because, I mean, tier limit is still the better fusion deck if you ask me, so there's no reason to play Alistair personally. Dragon Link, I actually think Dragon Link took sort of a hit in the sense where the Bestials aren't as good as they used to be because now tier limit isn't in the meta at the same rate, I would think. So the Bestials take a huge hit, and if the Bestials are less good, then Dragon Link would be like less good for how we've been playing it the last 3 months. But like regular Dragon Link now with like even the adventure package and going for like what's his name, Borland, is still pretty solid. Like, it's just a really good deck. So I'm gonna put this in tier 2. Do I like that? I feel like it's better than Springens for sure. But is it a tier 1.5 deck? Maybe when I readjust some things, I'll take a look at Dragon Link again, but I'm going to preemptively put it in tier 2. I think it will be good, but nothing too crazy. Branded, another really interesting deck to talk about because I think this deck is tier 1. It may end up being like the best deck in the meta, but another thing about Branded is Ash Blossom's coming back into the format, and Branded can just have some hands where like one Imperm or one Ash is horrifying for the deck. That being said, I think there are ways for the deck to adapt. It has Cartasia now, which is super good. They just have more plays than they used to, even when they were meta and Ash was around. I think Lindworm and all the support they got is just insane for the deck, and it's much harder to side for than something like Kashtira. Now, Ash Blossom is great versus this deck, and you know that is something this deck will have to prepare for, but I think it could end up being one of the better decks, if not the best deck this meta. It and Kashtira, I think, are perceived to be 2 of the strongest decks. And yeah, Branded, honestly, they just have so much more support than they used to, and they were already good back then. And we didn't get any Branded Fusion hit like the OCG has, so yeah, this is pretty much at full power, and I think it's going to be a very strong contender this format. Trap Tricks, unfortunately, the structure deck isn't out for another like 3 weeks by the time this goes up, a little less than 3 weeks, like 2.5 weeks, so it's hard to rate Trap Tricks without their structure deck. With their structure deck, I think they'll either be tier 2 or tier 1.5, so if you're looking for how I'm rating Trap Tricks post-structure deck, I think it's somewhere here. But for now, it's not this format. Unfortunately, again, structure deck doesn't come out for like another 2.5 weeks. Sword Soul, definitely a strong deck, and Sword Soul is kind of where I'm seeing how I'm going to have to pair some of these, because I think Sword Soul is around here, because again, we have like full power Sword Soul minus Protos, unlike the OCG that had hits, where Sword Soul is not that like amazing over there. I think I'm willing to put it, oh, it could be in tier 2 though, right? I don't know. I think Sword Soul is another one of these decks that finds itself here where it's going to be very strong, but I don't think it's competing with the decks above it per se. Like, I think all of these might end up being better than Sword Soul. I don't know. Like, there's still so much unknown with this format because it feels so much more open than it has been in so long that it's hard to like rate Sword Soul in decks that were good and haven't really taken any hits and they just now can come back into the forefront. The deck gets a lot of flex spots for an engine that's pretty solid, so I think this deck will be strong. I'm just not sure if it's going to end up actually being like tier 2, tier 1.5, or maybe even tier 1. So I'm going to put Sword Soul right here. Sky Striker as like a pure deck I don't think is that great, but Sky Striker Runic I think has potential, and I'm going to put it in tier 2. Like, even just playing like very few copies of Ray and just like playing linkage with Runic spells I've seen be pretty successful. And I think Sky Striker is a deck that can finally, like with the Shufflers only being at 1, gets a pretty huge boost because I think it's one of the better Runic options. So I'm willing to put Sky Striker in tier 2. Border Stun, I don't know. I think maybe not this format. I'm going to put it in Rogue. I think this deck has a huge problem with Kashtira, but it's okay versus everything else. Evil Twin. Evil Twin as like a pure deck isn't a thing, right? Or it's not a thing anymore since Sprite. I think Evil Twin Sprite is either up here with tier 1.5 or it's tier 2. I'm going to put it here for now. I think with Runic, it might end up being one of the best Runic versions. So I'm willing to say it's a Sprite variant that can also be 1.5. And yeah, this is a Sprite variant of Evil Twin. This is like pure Sprite. And then I guess I'll use Runic to sort of decide Sprite as well. Rescue Ace, not this format. I don't think this card's very good. I think there's just a trap deck that's 100 times better than it is. This deck really needs support. Emancipator, maybe Rogue. I'm gonna say not this format. Like, there's just so many combo decks that are better than this deck as well. I haven't seen this deck do anything in so long, I don't even know what to rate it. I'm just gonna say not this format because I think these decks are generally a little better. I mean, Emancipator's okay though, right? I'll say Rogue. Runic. Now, this picture I wanted to use Fountain sort of to judge like Runic Stun with like Floodgates. But now the Runic engine is so powerful and it's going to be popular that I'm willing to just put it up here. Like the Runic engine with Sword Soul, or not Sword Soul, with Evil Twin and Sprite, like these three can be a deck together. They can be kind of separate. I'm going to put them all preemptively in 1.5. I think this tier is much bigger than I thought it would be, and I'd expect more stuff up here, which is maybe I can move some stuff up there now that I'm looking at this tier list. But I think there's a lot of decks that are very, very strong, which is what this tier 1.5 is, but aren't in like contention for the best deck, which is what I'm putting in tier 1. So yeah, I'm willing to put all three of these like just right around here. Madolche, not this format. Without Tearlaments in the mix, even like a strong Vernia Sylph version, well, the Vernia Sylphs are really good. I'll put Madolche in Rogue. I think like they're a lot stronger than people give them credit for, but without a deck in the meta, well, actually, Madolche does line up very nicely into Branded to some extent, so I'm willing to put this in Rogue. Pearly, I'm going to say Rogue. I do think you could see this mixed with Sprite to some extent, although like with Elf getting hit, maybe it's even weaker than it was previously. I'm going to say not this format. I know this deck gets some support in Cyberstrike Access that's actually pretty good for it, or so I've heard. And I'm going to put it in not this format, and it just needs support similar to, you know, Rescue Ace. I think they both get support in Cyberstrike Access. I'm not 100% sure for Rescue Ace, but yeah, Pearly definitely gets support later that will make it a lot better. Weather Painter, I'm going to say, where to go? I'm going to say Rogue. I think this is just like a really strong Floodgate deck option, and it's an okay enough deck to call it Rogue. Its engine is solid enough. It's a little weak to hand traps, but yeah, you can just play a bunch of disgusting Floodgates, so this deck usually is okay enough. Pendulum, I think Pendulum, and this is more of like Draco Pals, right? That's the one I'm thinking about. They got the new support in Power of the Elements, or no, Darkwing Blast. I don't think Servant of Endymion Pendulums is actually going to be that great, but I think they might end up being in the same tier. I'm going to put them in tier 2. I think they're really strong options. I mean, essentially, it was a good deck that just got better because, I mean, tier limits got weak. So yeah, I'm going to put them in tier 2, although they could be 1.5. As the meta progresses, I wouldn't be surprised to see Pendulum go up to tier 1.5 here. I think it's a super solid option that is just a really strong deck. Altergeist, not this format. There's just a bunch of better trap decks than this one, like pretty much every trap deck is better than Altergeist right now, in my opinion. And Trap Tricks definitely post their structure deck, so Altergeist needs something. I think they need Link Cross back to really be a deck. But yeah, they're okay. Marincess, now, what do I think of Marincess? Because with Tearlament and the Shufflers mostly being gone, Marincess can find itself more in a place similar to where it was Nationals format. It was actually a very strong deck, and you can now more easily play like the one card starter with a bunch of hand trap strategies because the format's more open. That being said, I don't think it has a fun time until the perceived best deck, which is Kashtira. I think it has an awful time into that. So for now, I'm going to put it in Rogue. I think if it also doesn't have a fun time versus Branded because Mirror Jade on normal summon can be so bad. I think this deck is really strong, but I think the way the meta's lining up is just not like Marincess's time to be a tier 2 or 1.5 deck. So I'm going to put it in Rogue for now. Dragoon-like decks, I'm going to say in Rogue. Like, Dragoon is a lot stronger now that we're not in just a format way too powerful for him. So if you're playing like Guru or Dark Magician, they're a little better than they were before. Eldritch, I'm going to put Eldritch in Rogue. I think Eldritch is much better now that the Bestials are seen to not be as good as they were previously. But I do think Labyrinth is just better than Eldritch. Like, the Labyrinth engine is so much stronger than the Eldritch engine to me that I think if you're choosing a trap deck, Labyrinth is just always better than Eldritch. But it's decent enough if you just really want to play the Golden Lord, then he's okay right now. DDD, I'm going to put in Rogue. Definitely got a little bit of a boost, but nothing crazy. Paleozoic, not this format. With the tier limits getting hit, there's no really good way to play Paleo, and with Sprite not being, or specifically with Elf Band, I don't think Paleo is a good version of Sprite. So Paleo are going to have to take a much larger back seat than they have like the last couple formats. Crystal Beast, I'm going to put in not this format. Now that tier limit isn't the best deck, you can't just run like 48 good tier limit floodgates and call this deck okay. And I think this engine actually needs support before it can be a rogue deck again. Exo Sister, I'll put in Rogue. I think it's like a one card starter deck that can just play like, you know, Martha with a bunch of hand traps or good trap cards. It's still a solid deck, but it doesn't line up amazing into many decks in the format, so I'm just going to put it in Rogue. Harpies, not this format, they need support. B-Trooper, not this format, they definitely need something. I don't know what B-Trooper need, but they need something. They did just get a bunch of insect support, right? But I don't know if they work exactly with B-Trooper. Okay, if the new insect support is actually good in B-Trooper and it helps the deck a lot, I'd put it in Rogue, and I'm not sure about that. So because we got so much more insect support, I'm gonna preemptively put this in, no, not this format. But if the support did help it, you could consider it a rogue deck if you want. I just don't know enough. Punk is very interesting because if this was just last format a week ago, I actually thought Punk going into the next format would be just insane, right? Because Punk, in my opinion, was already good last format, or like good enough to play somewhat. And so you'd think that I would want to rate it higher, but looking at it, like, I don't know. I've been messing with the deck a little bit more. And now I don't want to play engines like the Magician Souls package, which was really good in the deck, but I don't really need to make Arclight anymore, so that doesn't need to be in there. All the Bestials I don't want to play, and that was a really strong engine in the deck, so it feels like it goes back to either just Hand Trap Punk, which is okay, or Gold Pride Punk, which is like, again, okay. I'm going to put Punk in tier 2. I think it's better than a lot of the rogue decks, and the Punk engine is actually very strong. But I don't know. I don't want to put it in 1.5 like I thought last format I might do after a ban list. I'm going to put it in tier 2 for now. Although there is something where I kind of want to try these two decks together, Punk and Runic, so I might try something with that eventually. We'll see how that works out. Zombies, I'll put in Rogue. It's like a strong enough engine that even though Fluandereeze isn't near as good as it used to be, it as an engine can somewhat play now. Gishki, I'm going to put in Rogue. I think without Sprite Elf, this deck took a gigantic hit. I think it is not one of the better Sprite variants. In fact, I think it's one of the least good Sprite variants now, because I feel like this deck really needed Elf. Like, it was a way to get another Abyss Search, which made the deck so much more consistent. You still have Coral Anemone, but I just feel if you're playing a Sprite variant, Gishki isn't really the way to do it. Dinomorphia, this is a deck that also got a lot better. Do I think it's Rogue or do I think it's like tier 2? I think Dinomorphia just got such a big boost, but one thing is Branded being one of the best decks means Masquerade is back, so I'm going to put it in Rogue. I just need a format where Dinomorphia is solid and Despia is not, because this deck hates Masquerade. But in a format without so much Masquerade, like this one I'm sort of perceiving to be, this could be really good. But this also struggles versus Runic, so I don't know. Maybe Dynamorphia is just going to be Rogue for a while. Dragon Maid, I'm going to put in Rogue. It's still like a decent Dragon Link variant, but I don't think it's too crazy. It really needs support in the form of Chambers Dragon. Ninjas, I'm going to put in not this format. I haven't seen anything better about ninjas post like the Banlist and Photon Hypernova. Even though they just got support, I don't see it being as good as these. I'm just not seeing people test with the deck or really show what it can do, so I don't really have as much faith in Ninja as I used to. ABC, I think, is a pretty strong rogue deck now. It definitely can play more with the shufflers out of the format, so yeah, ABC got a little bit better. Still rogue, I don't think it's tier 2. Dark World, very interesting. Here's the thing with Dark World. If the format was just like all these tier 2 decks, all these tier 1 decks and branded, and we take Kashtira out of the mix, I think Dark World is one of the best decks in the format by far. However, because Kashtira is the perceived best deck, this deck has an awful matchup versus that because it's just Macro Cosmos on legs, and Dark World hates that. That being said, I'm going to put them in tier 2 because if they're playing against anything that is not Kashtira, they can probably just like mop the floor with all of these decks. Like, these decks are prepared for normal decks. Dark World is not a normal deck. If it plays, it is the strongest deck I think I've seen in a very long time. It's truly disgusting. You don't get a hand. They can end your turn for free. They can play through like 26 interrupts. I mean, like, Dark World is honestly insane if it plays. So, but because of Kashtira, I think this deck is actually holding this deck back a little bit, and I'm going to put it in tier 2 for this list, and we'll see how that sort of plays out in the future. Burning Abyss actually got a lot better. Like, the shufflers aren't in the format, so Burning Abyss is quite a bit... Did I just say Burning Abyss? This is not Burning Abyss. Phantom Knight. Phantom Knight is quite a bit better. That being said, it's a rogue deck. I don't think it's tier 2. I don't think it's up here with these. These decks are better than PK if you ask me. Although with the Brave engine probably coming back quite a bit, maybe PK can make some return. Although I don't even really like Brave PK as like the main version. This is another interesting one. The Brave engine coming back in a big way, in my opinion. I think the Brave engine could be good. Makes a lot of decks, like the ABC deck, PK, Plunder Patrol down here, it makes them get a big boost, so we'll just have to see how that works out. I'm going to put Phantom Knight in Rogue, though. Infernity, not this format, they need a lot of support. Tri-Brigade, I'm just going to put in Rogue. Tri-Brigade Sprite doesn't really exist anymore. In my opinion, that deck needed Elf to be good, and Elf is gone. So, I don't think... Like, there are still ways to make Tri-Brigade Sprite work, don't get me wrong. I've seen some people testing with some things to make it okay, and like starter still gets you decently far, but it's just nowhere near as good as it was, and I don't think it's up here with the tier 2 decks. I think it's rogue. I think there's going to be a lot of rogue decks this format that are all these rogue decks are actually okay, right? Like, normally when I say rogue, when I was doing previous tier lists, it meant they were almost unplayable, but in this format, I think rogue is actually okay. So yeah, Tri-Brigade or Tri-Brigade Sprite, both can find themselves kind of here. Floowandereeze, I don't know. Here's the thing, right? Like, people are testing with Small World to get a different statue, the Water Barrier statue, to kind of do what Floowandereeze was doing before, and even ignoring that, right? Let's say that's not a thing. I do think M-Pen is still like a decent card, and the deck still gets Featherstorm. If the engine gets rolling, it's actually very good. I don't know if I want to say Rogue or tier 2. I don't know if Floowandereeze is over with the statue. I think it's a much more... It's an easier deck to deal with, although with Ash coming back in a big way and Hand Traps coming back in a big way, I do think we could find Floowandereeze down in Rogue. So I'm going to put them here. If the Small World stuff gets popular and it turns out like Floowandereeze can still play with Water Barrier statue, I would put it as a tier 2 deck. But yeah, for right now I'm going to put it in Rogue. Salad, Rogue, I think it got a lot better, but honestly I'm surprised Gazelle didn't come to 3. Like, I don't know why Konami is so afraid of Gazelle still, but maybe it's not this format. I think this deck needs 3 Gazelle to be a lot better. Adagnister, Rogue's just a solid, like, Marincess type deck. The 1-card starter with a bunch of hand traps. Nothing new here. Adagnister's okay. Rika, I think Rika is actually very strong because this deck hasn't been hit. In fact, everything else getting weaker has just made Rika a lot better than it used to be. And in engine, it has pretty decent outs to Kashtira. because the field spell is so good. Like, if you get access to multiple field spell, without even side deck cards, you can break a Kashtira board, and it can play a bunch of good hand traps, so I'm going to put it in tier 2. Although it may surprise me, and maybe I consider it up here. I do think this deck is stronger than a lot of the rogue decks, so interested to see if people pick up Rika and just combo with it again, because it is a very, very powerful deck. So yeah, I'm going to put Rika in tier 2. Oh, Konami. When do we get 3 Beatrice? Yeah, this is Burning Abyss, and until he gets 3 Beatrice, it's kind of just going to be here. Like, Beatrice at 1 versus being at 3 is only different for Burning Abyss, so we should just have 3 Beatrice at this point. Math Mech, I'm going to put in tier 2. Without the Bestials being in the format, I think once again this is the best Cyburst deck, which is unfortunate because I vastly prefer Marincess, but like Math Mech can come back into the format in quite a big way, I think. Even though I don't think its Kashtira matchup is great, I do think that Math Mech is a very strong contender and can come back into the format if the Bestials stay sort of down. If the Bestials become popular again for whatever reason, like maybe Tier Limit is secretly the best deck, you know, despite all the hits, then if the Bestials are popular, then Math Mech can fall back by the wayside again. But I think the Bestials are sort of sleeping for now, so I'm willing to put Math Mech here. Drytron, I'm going to do the same thing. Without the Bestials in the format, this deck is a lot better. But again, if the Bestials turn out to be popular, this deck is back in Rogue or not this format. But I don't think the Bestials are going to be that popular, so willing to put Drytron in a decently high spot again. Spellbook, I'll put in Rogue. I think there's still variants of Sprite with this that can work, but mostly as like a runic version. I think Spellbook can be an actually pretty cool runic variant, so I'm going to put it in Rogue. Prankhead's not this format. Mei Meowmu, rest in peace forever. I hate this deck, and it can stay right here. Naturia, Naturia is actually okay, right? I'm going to put Naturia in tier 2. I think the engine is fine, and it can play with the runic cards pretty well, and I think the runic engine is very powerful, so this might end up being one of the better runic decks. If it turns out not to be, maybe Rogue, because I think it also liked the Bestials a lot, and now you don't have to play the Bestials, which I don't know how that feels for the deck, but I think this is one of the better runic decks, so I'll put it in tier 2. Agents, not this format. It needs some help. It's getting a tuner in like the next set that the OCG has been messing with, like Apple Dragon or something. I don't remember his name. That could help this deck make better turn 1 boards, and it already has decent turn 1 boards, but its engine has to run a lot of bricks, and its going second isn't that great, so not this format. Generator, I'm going to put in Rogue. They got huge support, and I think they're pretty playable, so yeah, I'm willing to put it in Rogue. And then Plunder, I'm going to put in tier... Ooh. I'm going to put Plunder in tier 2. Maybe the best deck in tier 2. I think Plunder getting Fjord is a huge boost for the deck, and it has an amazing matchup in a Kashtira, especially when it goes first because of that, because you can just like give them a token, and that can mess them up quite a bit, but I don't know, I feel like it's still weaker than a lot of these decks, and yeah, I guess that's sort of how I'm going to rate this tier list. Looking at it, I think maybe you could say Labyrinth is tier 1, or maybe some Sprite variants are, but I think these two are what I'm considering like best deck contention, and these are all sort of equal-ish. We'll see how that sort of plays out. Again, we're still very early into the format. Things could change, but this is how I'm sort of looking at it. Post-ban list, I mean, it's not even out until next Monday, right? So, yeah, the ban list isn't out, and this is how I think it's going to look going into it, and we'll just see how it all plays out. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. This has been Aaron from Top Tier Gaming. Bye, YouTube.